Thank you all for being able to join us today. My name is Becca Reynolds, and I'm a part of the events team here at the library. And just to tell you a little bit about what we do each month, we put together about 30 or 40 programs as a team, either that are reoccurring or maybe these are a part of our theme. And so this month, October, we are exploring the theme No Horror. And we have Kris Spisak here with us, who is the author of the nonfiction book Becoming Baba Yaga, as well as the fiction book, The Baba Yaga Mask. She knows stories that linger have something to teach us, and the Baba Yaga tale does not disappoint. So I'm super excited to have you here with us today. And please join me in welcoming her, everybody at home.
Thank you so much, Becca. I am so excited to be here. And I will give a disclaimer that I apologize that I'm on the edge of sickness. So if I'm a little bit hoarse, just think about it as leaning into the spooky season. We're going with my witchy voice today. But I am here to talk all about Baba Yaga because, as Becca said in my introduction, I have such a belief that well-written words and well-told stories have the ability to change the world. Whether they are books and words and stories that you are writing in an email or a text message or writing your manifesto or the next great American novel or whatever it is, words have so much power behind them when we are intentional, when we are thoughtful, and the stories that we are told can change who we are and how we understand the world. So there's so many stories in the history of the world that have lingered, and the Baba Yaga stories fall into that category. Now, I don't know who's with me today who is really well acquainted with Baba Yaga as a folktale witch or as another presence that you might be familiar with. And I don't know who's with us today who maybe has heard of her. Maybe you've heard of her in goodness, in the John Wick video series, film series. Keanu Reeves' title character, his code name is Baba Yaga. We'll talk a little bit about that. And I don't know who's here with me who has never heard of Baba Yaga, and we'll speak to all of you here and give a little bit of an intro. But just as an introduction, she is a story that has existed in the written record since 1755. But if you start tracing back in time, you can find her in illustrations for hundreds of years prior to that, and records of a slight variant of her name that go back further and further in time. But then when you start examining her characteristics, her themes of her story, her ways that she changes people, and the ways that protagonists, whether they are named Prince Ivan or Vasilisa or whoever it is in these Slavic folktales, however they approach her, how they see her, you can find traces of that thousands of years ago in the creation of her character. So that's where we're going to go today. We're going to talk about a folklore witch here in the spooky season, but we're also going to look at where she might have come from and how examining an ancient world story can be empowering in your own life today. Because again, those stories that stick around, they stick around for a reason. So that's where we're going to be going today. So enter Baba Yaga. I love this picture of her. This picture's over 100 years old. Ivan Bilbin is one of the most famous illustrators of a number of her stories in some popular storybooks. And I'm going to pause here as I get into her description because she's often captured in stories of Russian fairy tales. And I'll get into my own background a little bit, but I'm Ukrainian, so I'm going to give a little bit of background here. So often she's captured in stories of Russian fairy tales and saying, well, wait a second, isn't she a Russian witch? So I'm going to pause there for a moment because, yes, she absolutely is a Russian witch. But when it comes to oral traditions, especially, they are not confined by modern country borders. Tales of Baba Yaga have gone back hundreds, if not thousands of years through present day Russia, present day Ukraine, present day Poland, present day Belarus, present day anywhere around the Black Sea, present day Eastern Europe. She has an incredibly wide footprint. So, yes, you will often find her in stories of Russian folk tales, but often remember that Sometimes it goes back to who the publishers were and where really solid translation partnerships were, especially in the late 1800s and early 1900s. London specifically had a really good publishing relationship with Moscow and St. Petersburg during this time. So, in the craze of the world being enamored by folk tales and a lot of publishers putting out collections of folk tales from all around the world, there was a really good publishing and translation record between Russia and the United Kingdom. So a lot of the collections that were carried through that point came from Russia, but she is not only a Russian witch. She is a Russian witch, but she's not only a Russian witch. She's also a Ukrainian witch and many, many others. So I always like to start with that. So who is Baba Yaga? Well, first think of your classic folktale witch of the woods. She is often living deep in the shadows. She is often very eerie. She always has a threat of she might eat you for supper if you are not good and kind to her. But she has some very specific characteristics that make her a little bit unique from other classic storybook witches. So I'm going to start with two here. First, this is the one that most people are quite familiar with. Um, Baba Yaga lives in a hut deep in the woods, but this is not your classic hut that is as you might imagine. Her hut stands upon chicken legs. So take a moment for that mental picture to hit for you. Her hut stands upon chicken legs. So if somebody comes to seek her, whether they're seeking her wisdom, her magic, her guidance, whatever it is that a protagonist is coming to seek, this folklore witch, if she does not wish to see them, the house will stretch up on its legs. Maybe imagine those chicken talons kind of scraping the dirt and the moss and the leaves of the forest floor, and it can turn itself around so whoever it is seeking her can't find the front door. Now, if that protagonist is incredibly persistent, that house can not only stretch up and turn, but it can also walk away and run away deeper into the forest, never to be found. Now, chickens aren't known for flying, as you know. So this is a hut that stays on the ground, but it does have those chicken's feet. Sometimes you'll hear it called fowl's feet, and they can be duck feet or goose feet and other type of bird feet. But most frequently, you will know her by her hut on chicken's feet. And as you saw in my cover, there is definitely a hut on chicken's feet in my latest book, which I'll talk about here momentarily. The second piece that people are most familiar with her is something that you can see in this drawing. Now, this drawing is has its own personality in its own right, as every illustrator should take their own slant. But in this one, you may or may not be able to tell what it is. Baba Yaga does not travel through the air on a broom like many Halloween style witches that you might be familiar with. Baba Yaga has a different means of transportation. Instead, she travels in a giant mortar, using usually a pestle as a kind of paddle to paddle her way through the sky. So, what am I talking about? Mortar and pestle. So, maybe you're thinking about this in terms of an apothecary where you have a basin of some sort that medicines are being mixed or ground in. Maybe you have a mortar in your kitchen and this is how you're um, mixing herbs and spices. Maybe this is where you're tossing your avocados in and making some really good guacamole in your mortar with your pestle, grinding it all together. So these are the two unique pieces that a lot of people know about Baba Yaga, her hut on chicken feet and the fact that she travels through the sky in a massive mortar, holding her pestle as a kind of paddle moving through the sky. Sometimes she does have a broom with her, but the broom is usually there to be let go so it can sweep away any tracks that she may or may not have left behind on this. But I want to pause for a second on these two concepts. Specifically, the second, this idea of a mortar. So, what is a mortar and a pestle? Yes, it's a kitchen tool. Yes, it's a medicinal tool. So, it's a tool that a lot of people had as a daily object around their homes, and especially an item of kind of classical women's work when these stories were being told. But you can also see a little bit of a metaphor here. Baba Yaga travels with a mortar and a pestle because what happens in a mortar and a pestle? It's actually a tool of transformation. Something goes in, and through a little bit of violence, a little bit of scariness, a little bit of grinding and pounding and twisting, whatever it is that goes into that mortar is transformed into something even more powerful. So think on that as you think of Baba Yaga. We'll get more into her metaphors as we move forward, but the fact that she travels with a more inside of a mortar with her pestle, this is your clue to her history. She is a woman, a witch, a spirit, a presence who is designed for transformation, and transformation often with a little bit of scariness involved, a little bit of toughness involved. Okay, so let me talk to you about for a moment about my connection with Baba Yaga. So as I said, I am Ukrainian. I'm first generation American on my mother's side, and I grew up in a household where 11 months of the year, I was a typical American kid, but 1 month out of every single year I spent with my grandparents. And in that month of the year, there was a lot of Ukrainian spoken, more so necessarily than English. There was Ukrainian dance, there was Ukrainian art and embroidery and recipes and folk tales and folk song. And when you're a small child, you don't always realize that the way you're living your life is different from how everybody else is living their life. But it's one of those pieces of who I am and who I've become that I have always cherished since that time, that I had such deep roots in this culture that a lot of people didn't know about. When I was a kid and I would talk to people about my Ukrainian family, classmates of mine, and this was a while ago, obviously, would say like, wait, do you mean Russia? And I'm not going to respond about what my grandmother would have said if she heard that question. But no, Ukraine, different country than Russia, different patriot, different traditions, language, culture, beliefs. There's so many things that since I can remember, Ukrainian pride is so much of so much of who I have become as a person. Nowadays, people know a little bit more about Ukraine and where it is on a map and the pride of the people. But when I was a kid, a lot of people didn't know this story. Specifically, growing up hearing a lot from my grandparents, I knew a lot about their experience during World War II. And during World War II, there are a lot of scary stories about World War II. There are a lot of stories from different perspectives that maybe we've been exposed to, or maybe we haven't been exposed to with World War II. But I grew up specifically hearing a lot of stories of an area of Western Ukraine called Galicia, that's far West Ukraine, and this root of the Ukrainian underground movement, the Ukrainian independence movement, where you have kind of Soviet forces coming in on one side. You have, in this moment of World War II, Nazi Germany coming in on this side. And so I grew up hearing these stories of Ukraine desperately wanting to be its own country. And I grew up hearing these stories of this 2 week period in 1941 where Ukraine was its own country. And so for a long time, I grew up hearing this and I was going to history classes and I went through middle school, high school, college looking for the Ukrainian perspective on World War II, and I just wasn't finding it anywhere. And so when I was doing all of this, I knew as a writer who loves writing, I wanted to find my way to expose the World War II Ukrainian version of history to the world. But I love fiction and nonfiction, but I love fiction. And so I finally found my way to do that through my book called The Baba Yaga Mask. Now, The Baba Yaga Mask came out in 2022, and it's the story of a Ukrainian grandmother who says before she dies that she wants to see Ukrainian soil or Ukrainian dancing on soil where it makes sense. Since World War II, she went to the States, has been there ever since. And so this Ukrainian grandmother flies to actually Warsaw, Poland, gets off a plane, and she disappears. And then it's the story of her two granddaughters, who are my generation, on a wild goose chase across Eastern Europe trying to find what happened to their grandmother. Is she okay? She's 90 something years old. Is she okay? Did something happen to her? Or is she up to something? Now, you'll notice as I'm talking about Baba Yaga, there's a title here. The title of this book is called The Baba Yaga Mask. The way I finally found my gateway to telling the story of Ukrainian World War II experiences from my family and so many Ukrainian families that I've connected with since was through folktales, because there's a universality in shared stories. And I don't know about your experiences with Ukrainian or Slavic folktales in particular, But I do know one thing. I know there are moments in the world where we watch the news or we look at the internet or we are looking outside our front doors, and sometimes things look scary. Things look dark. Things look shadowy. Things give us anxiety. Things give us tension. Things give us stress. So, through this idea of this grandmother who has these complex experiences, this is, I should also say, this is a dual timeline novel. So it goes back and forth between the present day hunt for this grandmother in Eastern Europe and her experiences in 1941 Ukraine, as World War II is really heating up there. Um, but as I'm going through all of this, I was trying to figure out how do I tell the story. And this idea of the anxiety of modern life, the anxiety of 1941 Ukraine as war is surrounding them. There's a lot of scary stuff in the world. But you know what? When you have a folktale figure like an ancient witch who reminds you that, you know what? Life can be scary. Life can threaten to gobble you up. Life can be terrifying. But if you are willing to endure and deal with that witch, if you are willing to face her head on, all of a sudden you realize how much stronger you could ever be. You realize that sometimes, yes, the shadows exist. Yes, the darkness exists, but we can get through it with our friends, with our family, finding the power within ourselves. And so Baba Yaga became the catalyst for me to tell the story that I desperately wanted to tell. And through the story of these sisters traveling through modern day Eastern Europe, trying to find their grandmother, who does, and this gives away nothing about the story, but this grandmother who does have an absolute obsession with Baba Yaga. And what if the way we deal with the anxieties and terrible things of the modern world, what if we embrace Baba Yaga and scare the world into being a better place? And that's where this grandmother's head is. Now, it's not a recommendation I'm giving to anyone. You shouldn't necessarily embrace the Baba Yaga lifestyle and be a terror to fix the world. But as a writer of fiction who adored playing with this character, it was a really a fun way to enter all of this. How do we fix the world? By scaring it to be a better place. That's kind of where Baba Yaga has existed for centuries in her folk tales. If people aren't being their best, Baba Yaga is there to transform them. If they can be better, all will be well. If they will not be their best selves, bad things will happen. And that's why she's fascinating as a character. But I always like to start this conversation about Baba Yaga and who she is and her complexities with my own gateway to her. I have known her story since I can remember, and I've always been fascinated by the complexities of understanding and belief systems. Because when I was a little kid, my grandparents were deeply religious, Ukrainian Catholics. But at the same time, my grandmother in particular had a deep understanding of old world belief systems where we would be leaving Ukrainian Catholic Mass, but then meanwhile, she would kind of put her arm around me and whisper in my ear to remember my best manners because so and so down the street is a witch. So how did this exist? And as a small child, this just caught me. How can one be deeply, deeply Christian, but also have this belief in witches that live among us? And this was, again, that fascination. I knew of Baba Yaga, but when my grandmother was a child in Ukraine, she was born in 1920. Her belief was that Baba Yaga wasn't a story. Her understanding was that Baba Yaga was a real force that lived deep in the woods. And as an imperfect child, this was someone who maybe she should be a little bit nervous about if one makes bad choices, if one is a little bit rebellious. So, my experience of Baba Yaga, knowing her as a story, but being aware of my grandmother's understanding of Baba Yaga, has been transforming through the ages. So the Baba Yaga Mask, my novel, came out in 2022. The audiobook came out in 2023. But as I've been traveling the country and doing virtual and in-person talks with book clubs and libraries and all sorts of things about the Baba Yaga Mask, talking about Ukrainian identity, Ukrainian history, Ukrainian traditions and art forms and embroidery and Ukrainian Easter eggs, pisanka, all sorts of things like that, I was finding more and more audiences who, wait a second, Baba Yaga, let's talk a little bit more about her. So I have been so honored that this led to my present next book, which is Becoming Baba Yaga, which just came out in September of this year. And I like to think of this book as the kind of behind the scenes. So you have the fictional take, but this book is definitely okay. Now that you might have known of Baba Yaga, whether through John Wick film series, whether, gosh, she's appearing everywhere now. She's been in Scooby-Doo episodes. She's been in Hellboy comics. She's been in DreamWorks episodes of Puss in Boots. She's been everywhere lately. Or maybe you knew her from the Baba Yaga Mask or Jenna Rose Nethercott's amazing book, Thistlefoot. She's just popping up all over the place. But it's been a very long time, decades, since there has been a nonfiction examination of who Baba Yaga is, how she became that way, that's accessible to the general public. So that book, we couldn't really find it, so I had to write it myself. This is my return to nonfiction. It's my fifth book. And it is going back into how did Baba Yaga become Baba Yaga, but also how does knowing old stories empower us? Again, I'm not recommending that we use the idea of my character in my novel of scaring the world into a better place, but how can examining old stories empower who we are today? How can it allow us to understand who humanity has been in the past, and how can it give us a different perspective of who we could be in the future? I think secrets, that especially stories, especially ones that have stuck around for a really long time, they have these secrets within them. So that's what I want to talk about. Okay, so jumping back into Baba Yaga herself. So she is in a house that stands upon chicken legs. She travels through the sky with a mortar and pestle. She has different representations depending on the stories that where you will find her, depending on the tellers. Baba Yaga, like many world stories, is the source of the longest game of telephone that people add their own versions to the story. And the story that started centuries ago, someone whispered it, and then someone whispered it, and someone whispered it. And so thus you have all of these complexities of who she ever has been and who she is in the present day. But let's take it back in time. So I like to talk about the story of grammar and goddesses, not only because Baba Yaga and I share our first book is a book about grammar. My first book, because as I said, I've been fascinated by language and language empowerment for a long time. My first book is called Get a Grip on Your Grammar, and it is a book all about empowering your language use in a way that hopefully does not make you want to yell at people on social media, in a way that does not make you fall asleep like some English class that you may or may not remember when you're having to learn about the subtleties of language. But my first book was called Get a Grip on Your Grammar. And Baba Yaga's first written record is actually in a grammar book. So personal connection. But let me tell you the story. So the first time we know her as a folktale character was in the 1780s. However, the first time Baba Yaga is in print, she was in a book called The Russian Grammar. Now, if you're thinking about grammar as in language use, different type of grammar. I'm talking about grammar as in grammar school, a grammar book as in a book that would be kind of an elementary school age textbook that would have all sorts of information across a plethora of subjects. So that's what I'm talking about. Her first book that she existed in was a book called The Russian Grammar in 1755. The fascinating thing about this, it was a textbook. There were zero folk tales in this book. But where she existed in this book was a section on world mythologies and world belief systems. And there was a table of deities, of gods and goddesses from across the world. Now, this was 1755 Russia, so I'm not going to say it was an all-inclusive book by any means. However, there was a fairly elaborate table for its time of different belief systems. So you had one row, for example, where you would have Jupiter and Zeus and the Slavic god Perun and Odin and kind of the king of the gods next to each other from all of these different world belief systems. And then you would have kind of the god of war across all of these different belief systems, the god of love for all of these different belief systems. And it was a very complex table, so you can compare and contrast and all of this stuff. Now, this is where it gets interesting. Baba Yaga's first reference was in this table of world deities, not as a witch, but as a list and reference on this table of world deities. So that is definitely something that makes you pause and reconsider this folktale witch and where she came from. The second part that is fascinating about her first existence in text in 1755 is the fact that in this table, where you have all of these different belief systems and everyone has a relation, she is on a line with no comparable of any world belief system the world over. So suddenly, Baba Yaga, we see her in a different light. We see Baba Yaga as this force for empowerment. We see this character, perhaps witch, perhaps deity, as this force connected deeply with the earth, a force who is connected deeply with the beginning of life and also the end of life, one who potentially transports souls from into birth and then out into whatever is next beyond death. And she has all of these complex characteristics, yet nowhere is there comparable anywhere in this book. So that is just absolutely fascinating to me. So that's where she was first introduced. And prior to that, you have illustrations of her. And when I say illustrations prior to this, there were decorations that would hang in households around the Black Sea. They were called lubki. Icons were very expensive. Sometimes people had icons hanging up around their house, but oftentimes there were cheaper decorations around houses where people would paint their own houses, and people would sometimes purchase what were called lubki, and they were um, wooden art form. So it's pretty much take a linden tree, peel off the bark, and that kind of first layer of wood right inside the bark, these would be cut and then they would be decorated. They would be inked with boiled linseed oil to make an ink. And then there would be an illustration that is made from those pieces. These illustrations, sometimes they were biblical scenes, sometimes they were folk tales, sometimes they were political satire where you had actually early political cartoons, which I absolutely adore. Political cartoons have been around for a very long time, but we have some of these loop key hundreds of 100 years or so before Baba Yaga's first appearance in print. And these lube key have a character on it that is very clearly Baba Yaga down to details of her appearance and having her mortar and pestle and all sorts of different aspects of her. So we have her pictorially. So if her first reference is as a deity, that tells you this is not her introduction. If her first, if we know of her as someone who can be understood pictorially, if we can understand her and the people at large understand her by a picture, she's already clearly well established in their culture at this point. So she has a long history that goes back and goes back and goes back. And it goes back to that idea of my grandmother having this dual belief system of having deep roots in Christianity, but also having deep roots that understand this concept of witches and kind of rural country pagan beliefs existing side by side. If you look at Slavic belief systems over hundreds of years, you can actually pick out a number of different goddesses along the way. And these goddesses often have breadcrumbs to who she is as a character today. For example, when you think about kind of a Halloween style witch, you imagine kind of this long nose. And again, with the telephone game, there are absolutely true examples of anti-Semitism with an appearance issue that someone is playing with a nose or something like that. However, there was also a goddess 500 or so years back in the regions around the Black Sea, who is known to give help to those who are worthy, to help their family, to help their character, to help one's fortunes, if she would accept offerings in a sacred grove deep within the Slavic woods. And how she would accept these offerings is this goddess was said to be blind. But she had a very, very long nose because when one gave her offerings of, say, freshly baked bread, if that bread was old and stale, it was said that the goddess would know from her long nose that this is old, stale bread. This is not freshly made. Or if someone were to give fruit, if this was full of worms and rotting, the goddess's nose would detect how serious you were in your faith, in your respect, in what you were bestowing to her. So it was this nose of this goddess and the same geographic footprint of Baba Yaga, who also has this classic, what we sometimes think of as like a Halloween style witch nose. Well, that's something that's kind of interesting. There was a different goddess in the region who had a throne that was a mortar. Interesting. There was a different goddess of the region that has all of the same characteristics that Baba Yaga is said to have had as a deity, this connection deep within the earth, this connection of deep having deep respect for the animals and all sorts of different things, having a deep connection with life and death. One of these goddesses was named Mokesh. So Mokesh was a goddess, and in the year 980, and I'm not saying 1980, I'm saying the year 980, there was a prince of Kiev. Kiev, Ukraine, is a very old city. There was a prince of Kiev named Prince Vladimir in 980 who raised a giant statue to this goddess Mokesh, who has so many of the same understandings of belief systems and understandings of power and representations of Baba Yaga as we know her in future days. So Prince Vladimir put up a statue to Mokesh in 980. Now, roughly in this time, Christianity enters the region. Prince Vladimir converts to Christianity, and 8 years after he puts up the statue, so in the year 988, Prince Vladimir, who put up the statue, tore down the statue of Mokesh. And all of a sudden, this tale starts being told of this person who was, or this individual, this spirit, this deity who was once revered is suddenly pushed off to the shadows. For some, only the uneducated believe in her. Only those who kind of do magic and all this kind of less modern day stuff, which is funny to talk about in the year 988. But she was pushed off, and her belief system was pushed off to the woods, off to the shadows, off to the darkness. And belief systems challenged each other. And it makes you think about Baba Yaga. She was introduced as a deity in the Russian grammar in 1755, and then 25 years or so later, her next major appearances are as a witch. You suddenly have these belief systems batting heads, but as a witch, she has these lingering details that fascinate us. There's that question that Baba Yaga, the folklore witch, asks so many of her protagonists. She asks, are you here to do deeds, or are you here to run from them? So I'm going to pause on that question for a second. Whether the protagonist is named Ivan, because they're always named Ivan. It's like Jack in British fairy tales. Just Ivan is always the name if it's a male. And then if the protagonist is female, you often have Vasilisa. Others, of course, but those are the two biggest ones. Are you here to do deeds, or are you here to run from them? So think on that for a second. If you, as an individual, woke up every single morning and you asked yourself this question that Baba Yaga, the folklore witch, asks her protagonist, okay, today, when you wake up, am I going to do deeds today, or am I going to run from them? Now, that might mean something different to each of us. That might mean something different to each of us on any given day or moment or phase of our life. But that's a pretty big question. Are you here to do deeds, or are you here to run from them? And Baba Yaga, the folklore witch, often is this transformational force. Again, go back to that idea of her living or not living, traveling with a mortar. For those who are answering that they are here to do deeds, Baba Yaga is a helper. She's almost a fairy godmother in those tales. This is not a classic folktale witch of early Disney creation where just you have the evil witch with the apple, and that is the end of her character development. This is a witch who has some expectations. If you can prove yourself to her, she can be a force of good and a force to help you be your better self, a force to help you on your quest, a force to empower you for the next steps of your journey. This appears in a different way as well. Often is through that question. Often it is through a series of trials and tests that she gives her characters. Sometimes she gives trials and tests where she wants to measure a couple things, but if the protagonist, no matter who they're named, prove that they are brave enough to go after whatever they want to go after, if they prove themselves respectful to someone who might look different from them, who might seem to act different from them, someone who is kind to not only her chicken-legged hut, but the animals of the forest, the earth around her, and someone who is hardworking. If those four traits, and it's consistently those four traits, are shown to Baba Yaga, all of a sudden she becomes this fairy godmother-like character. Now, this is a Slavic fairy tale, so she's very dark also. But it's consistently something that, as a modern reader of these folk tales, you almost can see Baba Yaga as a macabre life coach. She's dark and she's creepy, and if things go wrong, they will go very, very wrong. But you can take this guidance that if you were to meet this folklore witch of the woods, would you pass her test? Are you respectful to those around you, even if it's some woman at the edge of the woods who might be a little bit scary, even if it is someone who is different from you and those who you normally mingle with? If you are to meet someone, and are you respectful? Are you brave enough to go after what you want? Or do you just live your day running from things? Are you brave enough to go after it? Are you kind to the earth, to the animals, to your house, whatever it happens to be? And are you hardworking? Suddenly we see Baba Yaga as almost this life coach figure, which is fascinating. Now, as I said, in this moment, Baba Yaga is popping up all over the place. She's in John Wick. She's in DreamWorks Puss in Boots. She's in Hellboy comics. There was a malware that was going around a couple years back. That was the Baba Yaga virus that was attacking computers. Um, there was, in present day events in Ukraine, the Ukrainian army actually had a Baba Yaga missile that they had created. Baba Yaga is popping up all over the place. In the Baba Yaga Mask, I have a foreword that was written by Jenna Rose Nethercott, who is the author of the international bestseller Thistlefoot, a novel that also features Baba Yaga and her chicken-legged hut. But in that foreword, Jenna Rose calls Baba Yaga the it girl of the moment. Now, I love that so much because when you think about Baba Yaga, or excuse me, when you think about an it girl, you might want to think about like a Hollywood starlet or something like that. But it's true, Baba Yaga is popping up all over the place right now. And why? I really think it has to do that we're living in this moment of anxiety. This is a moment of stress that no matter what is going on in our individual lives, there's kind of a constant hum around us that is hard to ignore of things going wrong. Our brains were not developed to deal with a 24-hour news cycle and constant updates on X and all of the different social media platforms. Our brains were not designed chemically to be able to deal with this pressures and bad news and stressors from around the world every single second of our days. That's just not how we were built. But we're dealing with a moment in history that we're confronted with so much that is scary around us all the time. And I think Baba Yaga is popping up all over the place right now because she is that dichotomy of the horror and the hope. That there is this idea of there is stress and fear, but there is also transformation. And if we're willing to, yes, admit there is scary stuff happening right now, but through it all, if we can find our ways to be our best selves, we can transform. Our families can transform. Our friends can transform. Our communities can transform. Our country can transform if we're willing to see the darkness and then be brave, and then be hardworking, and then be resolute. And I think there's a lesson hiding with the modern day obsession with Baba Yaga. Now, before I keep going, I'm going to just speak for a couple more minutes and we'll have some questions if anybody has any questions. But whenever you look at Baba Yaga tales, you always want to look at them in terms of who is the teller? And this is true with any tales, right? Who's the one telling the story and what's their objective? Because sometimes the story is not just the story. The story often has intention behind it. And understanding the teller's intention and the teller's moment in history can make us understand a story so much. Not only in this nonfiction book, Becoming Baba Yaga, do I get to do a nonfiction analysis of how Baba Yaga became Baba Yaga over thousands of years. So we have cultural transformations happening. We have the history of civilizations and all sorts of things happening here. One of my favorite reviews of this book was that it's Yuval Noah Harari meets Brene Brown with a touch of the macabre. And that's my favorite review because I am honored to be named among such names. But One thing I love is that in the analysis and research, I'm an academic at heart. I love putting on white gloves and diving into old library archives to find the secrets of this kind of stuff. Amid all of that, I actually go back and forth between the analysis and the empowerment and the exploration, but also the folk tales themselves. Because again, as I said when I started out, some people might know Baba Yaga deeply. And if you do, you're going to recognize the folk tales that I include here. Some people might not be familiar with her at all, and this is kind of your introduction. So does go back and forth between the nonfiction and then the retellings of the tales. But I will say that I do a modern retelling of the tales. I own up to every single change that I make. But this is not a collection just of the folk tales. This is a collection where I just have snippets of many of them to kind of help us analyze where did that come from? What is this moment in history that might have birthed this story? What tiny Siberian culture has a tradition that might have somehow found its way into this doll that exists in this story? Lots of secrets hide between the tales, and we go and explore all of them in here. But before we wrap up, I wanted to give you a little taste of one of them. There is one story that is dated to around the year 1800, and it's about the birth of Baba Yaga. Now, after everything that I just told you, if the first story about her origin comes in 1800, how accurate do you think that origin story is? Not very much. So I'll give you that much. Um, there are also moments in here that you're going to see moments of its day. There are pieces that I changed here, but what I'm going to read to you, my version of this story. But after I read it to you, I'll tell you what I did and didn't change. And you'll be shocked, startled maybe by what was actually the true story versus my version, because my changes are actually quite small. So this is The Birth of Baba Yaga, one of the retellings in my book. To better tilt the planet's spin, the devil determined the essence of evil must walk the earth. He imagined all the eels and urchins and wolves and rats whisked together into a froth, but it wouldn't do. He imagined thunder and fog and tar and sludge, but horror he knew wasn't the same as the squalid unknown on a charcoal black night. So the devil stole boots from the best cobbler he knew and set out to find his ingredients. In a foreign market, a shriek of rage snared his attention. A woman berated a man twice her size as she stepped in front of her children. The big man pussyfooted away, and the children smiled, but the devil swept up the woman for his bag. Across the globe, in a schoolhouse surrounded by fields of swaying wheat, a classroom bully stood up to challenge the teacher, a taunt on young lips, a sneer on the smile. Yet the teacher's eyes narrowed and pierced the self-assured gaze of her pupil, sending the younger feet scurrying back to the desk from whence they'd come. The devil liked what he saw and swept the teacher up. He swept up a woman, the smartest in a room of arguing voices, who didn't speak up to share the answer she knew. He swept up a woman who punched hard when a stranger pressed a hand to her skin, and another who screamed when a man told her to smile. A woman clutching wolfsbane, a wife steeping oleander tea, a green-thumbed gardener who nurtured her bougainvillea full of thorns, a widow who ran her fingers through her gray-rooted hair until it stood up on end, and another who unabashedly cursed and swore and raised her glass again with no shame. A woman who followed her gut, ignoring the advice given. A grandmother that cackled with joy as she slammed her door shut on the modern world, preferring her mortar and pestle, her wood fire stove, and the blissful silence that came when technology and its constant interruptions disappeared. The devil dumped his bag of 12 women into a massive cauldron, muddling them in water from an iced over stream. The fire underneath crackled. The water bubbled, then boiled. A clamminess filled the air of the little hut where he did his work, a hut that began to lurch and pull like it wanted to flee. Then the devil took a giant breath and filled his lung with the women's steam, a taste like beets or onions or garlic or fire. He took in as much as his immortal body could hold. He held it in scarcely for a second, enough to feel its fury and fight, and then he spit it out. There, before him, stood Baba Yaga, the essence of malevolence from the most evil beings on earth, or so supposed he, and who would dare correct the devil? Why I love that story so much is the original tale, written around the year 1800, was titled The Tale, and I am not messing with this translation. This was the first English translation name. The Tale of the 12 Nasty Women. I'm going to let that sit there for a second. The Tale of the 12 Nasty Women. And it's true. That's how, well, true, as in that was the first version that was written of her origin, of the most evil beings on earth, clearly, were 12 women. So again, I'm going to let that sit there. Um, the fact that the devil exists in the story tells you in itself that it's a more modern version. The devil is a Christian character. He is not somebody of the Baba Yaga world. Her stories feature immortal wizards like Koshi the Deathless. The fact that the devil is in her stories is saying that this is coming from a certain interpretation about bringing her to her place of evil. This was early in her stories as a folklore witch. So the devil exists. The pure version of evil must be women. The only part of that that I changed was the existence of who the women were. Because in the original tale, it just talked about these 12 evil women being the most evil beings on earth. It was not a matter of any details about them. Um, but all the other details about the collecting the women in his bag, boiling them over iced over stream, taking in the steam of them and spitting them out to become Baba Yaga, that was how she was evil, and that's how I like to twist the story on the end, or so thought the devil, and who's going to contradict him, which is kind of fun. But I'm going to pause there for a second. Does anybody have any questions?
We do
Becca.
have one question here in our chat box, which is or sorry, in the Q&A that is asking if the library will be ordering these books and if you need to fill out a suggestion for purchase. You do not need to fill out a suggestion for purchase. That's something that I've done. So our collections team does a pretty good job of getting those books in a reasonable amount of time. So to answer that question, I have put those requests in. But we also have a question over here in the chat box. I'm wondering if you discovered strong links with this goddess deity and Kali, the Viking slash Scandinavian goddess, historical figures.
Oh, I absolutely adore it. When you think about mythology systems and you think about oral traditions, I think sometimes migratory routes trade many things, and I think stories are among the cargo. And you can find links between Baba Yaga stories and influences in so many different directions that you can tell breadcrumbs were picked up here and became something completely different over here. And with Baba Yaga, I think it's one of those ideas that you can find traces to the character of who she is back 7,000 years in Eastern Europe, which is just mind-blowing to even conceive of what 7,000 years even looks like. There was a society called the Tripolia culture that existed around the Black Sea at 5,000 before the Common Era. And they had advanced pottery and kilns that were more advanced than what they were doing in ancient Egypt at the time. Anyway, side note, but there are pieces of her from there or a goddess deity female figure that may or may not be linked to the Baba Yagas that we know of today that show up. And there are people in Viking and Scandinavian and Norse mythology that you can find these connections with Baba Yaga and Kali. I love that you said that. Absolutely. There could deep connections there, but there are also connections with her loosely and Loki at times, because sometimes she is kind of goes in one direction and sometimes she kind of goes into a more of a trickster mode, depending on her story. But absolutely. And you can also find connections with her in Greek mythology. There is a battle that sometimes exists between Baba Yaga not having a house on chicken's feet, but Baba Yaga sometimes has she most frequently has bony legs, and that's kind of how she's known. And sometimes you can interpret those bony legs as kind of she is walking one foot in death and one foot in life, or she is able to go between life and death and talk to souls on both sides. But sometimes instead of bony legs, she actually has a serpent tail in some versions of the tales, and there's deep connection between Baba Yaga and her serpent tail and some Greek mythology stories of the Echinida, um, and a battle with a hedgehog that exists in both stories. So yes, there you can kind of find breadcrumbs all over the place, and there's definitely a lot of you can play with the Norse mythology. Grimm fairy tales too. There's a big argument that the witches of Grimm's fairy tales were born from Baba Yaga, but I know people have their biases and stuff, and there's giant academic debates on such things. I believe it, but I am just one voice in the debate.
Wonderful. I have a question. You talked about the first time Baba Yaga is seen, she's a deity, and then she is then a witch.
Right.
So my question is, and you said, if I remember correctly, this was the 1750s.
Yeah.
So what do you know what was happening culturally that maybe added to that shift of deity to witch?
I think Baba Yaga as a character and kind of all of the forces and tales that may have inspired her were around for kind of centuries. And I think this deity to witch seemed to be happening in Eastern Europe, but I think in many places around the world when belief systems clash. Going back to that Mokesh, she was a deity. Nope, she's a witch back in 988. I think this is a story that was told again back and forth, and no matter every time she became a witch in the past 1,000 years, it seems as if this spirit of helping the future, helping you be your best self, kind of lingered even in her most evil versions. Now, get me, these are dark Slavic fairy tales. She is always threatening to eat people for dinner, and there's a lot of darkness here. And there's a lot of like horror aspects if you're a horror fan. A number of her tales, like they go pretty dark and deep. But at the same time, it seems to be fitting a pattern that kind of repeated it over a thousand, or excuse me, hundreds of years. And I like to think back of when you think about oral stories, and even just in your own life, perhaps, or in past generations of your own family, who were the tellers of the tales at bedtime? Now, I know at least for me, and I think I have parents who actually were both big tellers of tales at bedtime, but culturally, parents historically are always in moments of juggling, right? They're trying to make sure to do everything they can to make sure their families are fed. There is food on the table, there are clothes, there is a house, all of this. And parents have historically been trying to take care of the 100 things for their family. And whether that is inside of the house or outside of the house, parents are always doing 100 things. Historically, women live longer than men. And when you think about the culture of storytelling, who were the most common tellers of these tales? Grandmothers were most frequently the tellers of the tales. So I like to think that every single time there was this demonization of life force, goddess, deity, witch, however you want to say it, of whoever this spirit was, of the strong female force. And the strong female force in Eastern Europe is so present. I mean, when you think about Mother Russia, there's just this presence, strong female presence that is just there for so long. But who was the teller of the stories? It was the grandmothers. They were the ones who had the moments. And maybe they were sitting there with their mortars grinding the grain, which took forever, but they were the ones to do it because it was very simple to sit still for hours to do such things. They were the ones who were entertaining the stories for the children, and they were the ones who kept the kicking, fighting spirit of Baba Yaga or the goddess or the witch alive, scaring the children into being their best selves, perhaps, reminding that, you know what, life sometimes has its scary moments, but you know what, even in the scary moments, you be your best self, you keep being brave, you keep working hard, keep being nice, you keep being respectful to everybody, good things are going to happen to you. Even when there's darkness. And the grandmothers of hundreds of years, I think that's the story we all kind of need sometimes right now.
Yeah, I like that. That's dichotomy.
Yes, exactly.
We have another question. What specific books might have been available in Germany in 1850 or the United States in 1900?
So the Grimm brothers and kind of like the fourth folklore revolution were really starting to hit at this point. The Grimm brothers were getting their fame for all of their fairy tales a little bit earlier than this, but a rough that time. And there's this major interest in folklore studies that's really popping up right here. In the English translation record, the kind of often, as I said, they're often called Russian fairy tales or Russian folk tales, but that's again just translation partnerships between Russia of that day and England of that day. These are kind of Slavic tales that cover a lot of territory. A lot of those started popping up in the late 1800s and early 1900s in the back of Becoming Baba Yaga. I mean, this is nonfiction, it's a research piece. I have a pretty in-depth bibliography that actually goes back into some of the sources and some of the first stories of hers that were told. Sometimes they were translated in magazine collections because magazines and journals, that kind of things, were a very popular form of entertainment, as you know, from many different sources. And then you started having these collections of fairy tales that were put out from different areas of the world. You'd have the Grimm fairy tales, of course, from the Germany region and Germanic traditions, but you would have collections of fairy tales and folk tales from all over that were really becoming popular during this time period. But the English translation record was usually hitting late 1800s, early 1900s. But there, look up early folk tales of early Slavic folk tales or early Russian folk tales, and there's a very comprehensive list.
Awesome. Well, I don't see any more questions out here. So I just want to say thank you so much for joining us today. This was fascinating, and I look forward to getting both of your books in our library for folks to enjoy. So be sure to check back on our website if you are interested in checking that book out. So thanks again.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. And if anybody's interested more in more about my books, I teach a lot of workshops and do a lot of on Instagram. I'm talking about the subtleties and secrets of words and stories all the time. So follow on Instagram just at Kris.Spisak, or my website is full of random trivia and tips and empowerment for yourself. But again, thank you for having me.
Yeah, and I will link your website into my follow-up email for everyone who joined us today with our standard survey. So if you're interested in checking that out, that'll be included.
Thank you.
All right, thanks again. I hope everybody has a great rest of your day.